Hello, my friends. I wanted to share with you a tutorial on how to use AWS Lambda and also use AWS Lambda with API Gateway so that you could make web pages that pull data from Lambda functions. So let's go ahead and get started. So first I will share my other screen and you will have access to this. All right, so purpose is to create Lambda functions. And so I'm going through my own tutorial. Some people get written access to this, and me talking through it is a way to help people get unstuck or just to do it this way if they prefer not to read a whole bunch. Okay, so Lambda functions are oftentimes used, well, they're used two different ways. Like one is they're used kind of in real time synchronously where a request is made from a web page and people expect an immediate response. And then there's another way where there's like a bunch of back-end tasks that are running and the tasks can take as long as they want. It's just kind of like a queue. You just want it to get done. Kind of like when you send your paperwork to your accountant, like you don't expect to sit in front of your accountant until he gets all your taxes done. If he gives them to you in a week or a month, you're just like, yeah, whatever. So that would be asynchronous invocation of Lambda functions. So this one's synchronous. And I'll have another lab for the other example. All right, so we're going to learn all these things, creating a Lambda function, connecting Lambda functions to API Gateway, including web pages, and learn about using blueprints. And by the way, it's like super early in the morning right now, and I'm in a hurry, so hopefully my brain is on and working okay, and I don't stumble over things too much. Okay, so we have our fictional company, Paradise Donut Company, and they want to start using microservices. And so what do I mean by microservices? Well, imagine going out to a website like Amazon. One way that they could generate a web page like this is they could have a server note that a request has come in, generate one big fat web page with every single detail in here as a piece of static HTML, and then send it back down to your browser. But another way that is common is we use, well, there's a variety of different ways that we can do this, but we make static web pages. And so we send down basically a template for the web page, and then we'll use some JavaScript calls to actually fill in a bunch of the dynamic portions of the page, like how many things are in your cart. So with the microservice-based approach, maybe you send down the HTML page that looks roughly like this, but then there's an additional JavaScript call that goes back out as soon as the page is shown on your web browser, and that JavaScript call asks how many things are in the cart, and when it gets that answer, it updates this. And then similarly, every single box on this page could be a microservice call where a JavaScript service is running on the back end. Well, anyway, you make a JavaScript call out to a specific URL that tells you 4 things that relate to where you left off, or 4 things for continue shopping deals. So you could technically have a different call for each one of those, and none of this data is hard-coded directly in the HTML. So that's the idea, and that's in some ways we might say that's a modern way of doing application development because it allows for tremendous scalability. So that way, maybe it's harder to scale up this service than it is to do that service, or vice versa. And so you could have, if you're Amazon, you could have 10,000 servers for that and 5,000 servers for that. And you could scale your architecture based on the actual load that's coming down or coming into you. All right, awesome. So let's go back to whatever our next instruction is. Okay, so the idea here is you got 30,000 locations as a company, and and it's a donut company, and you want to have something scalable for serving up a list of donuts that comes out of a Lambda function. And what is a Lambda function? It's a Docker container that's running the programming language, your favorite programming language, whatever that is. But you don't have to manage that Docker container. All you have to do is upload, as a little code or a lot of code. It could be as simple as a single function, or it could be a whole program. But at the end of the day, it runs through a single entry point for a function call. and then you can send something back out as a result of that function call. So that's kind of the big idea there, as confusing as that might sound. In this particular example, I'm going to create a static list of donuts in an array, but in a future lab, I will do this exact same thing, but I will have us connect to a database. And so a database could be a relational database, or it could be a NoSQL database like DynamoDB. But in this case, as the first proof of concept for using Lambda functions, I will start off with just doing an array. All right, and here's visually what it looks like as part of this lab. So you have a computer, which is actually a web browser. It makes a call to a specific URL. That URL is basically an API endpoint service that AWS looks at it and goes, what do I do with this URL? Oh, let me send that over to the Lambda function, generate some data. It goes back to that service, and then that service sends back a JSON message to your web browser. And then I'm going to do this two different ways. One is when we're building Lambda functions, recently there's a quick and easy way to generate a URL for your function. That is quick and dirty. Once you get into a more mature development process, you realize, oh, I'm oftentimes going from version 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 of my API, my URLs that are being called via JavaScript, and maybe I need to keep the old ones live. And so you start worrying about things like versioning and testing and stuff. So you don't just have one, you have a whole bunch. And for that and a number of other reasons, you would start using API Gateway Service, which gives you more control over your APIs and the URLs associated with your Lambda functions. So I will show you both of those. So this is like the quick and dirty entry way to do things, and this is like the more robust way of doing things. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's find Lambda, create a function, and call it daily donut list, and click create. All right, so we go into here, we type in Lambda, we type create function, and I'll call it daily donut list. I'm going to leave it at the default, which is the most current version of Node. Notice that I could use a bunch of other Docker containers that are going to run other language runtimes, but I'll just start off with this one. And I'm going to leave everything else at its defaults and click create function. Drum roll in my head, or just panic because it's taking too long. 5 seconds is too long. Come on, this is a computer. All right, so there is my result. When you do this manually through the console, this right here represents a graphical representation of your function. Down here is the code that is, so I just accepted what they said. Down here is a code editor, and here's some code that basically represents hello world. They're calling it index.jms. This word handler represents a function that they run in the Docker container. So they're going to run this function called handler. The function expects an event. So you pass in some data. It could be empty. You don't have to pass in meaningful data. It can be empty data. But if you think, like, why do you create functions anyway? Well, it's usually because you're processing some data, making some decisions, and then sending something back to the user. So this is where that data would get sent in. And in this case, we don't do anything with it. We just generate this JavaScript object called response, and we send it back to the user. So the body property is what we're going to read going back to the client, and we just send it back to them. So we don't even do anything here, part one. We have some extra navigation here, and let's just try and go through it in order. So let's come back up and see what I say to do. I say, well, let's go ahead and test the Lambda function. So we will create a test event that uses an empty JSON document. So we're going to go to the test tab, create an event, call it empty event, make it empty. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So here are a bunch of things that we can do related to our function. So we'll leave our code as it is. We'll come over here and we'll create a new event. We will call it test event, and we will delete the stuff in there. Not that it matters all that much, but it's essentially going to be empty. And then we will find save somewhere. I will click save. And there's a variety of ways that I could, hold on, my navigation just got in my way. Okay, I'll hit save and then I will hit test. And then after I hit test, I want to look at the results, the notable things. So I hit save, now I'll hit test. It's executing it, and it executed it like super fast. And let me expand it and see what happened. It says, if you run that function that's over in this tab, then this is the data that got sent back. And then we have some other information about running this function. It gave it an ID. It tells us how long ago it ran. We can see how long the function ran for, and then we get that information again down here. This information actually, every time you run your function, gets recorded to CloudWatch, the logging service in AWS. So, and I think this might as well. So because you're always going to be having broken code while you're developing, all of your error messages will show up in CloudWatch as well as here. This is just copying it. So whether it's running in production or you're just in testing, data in this exact format is displayed so you can kind of see certain things. So you can see how long it took to run the function, 124 milliseconds, etc. Well, that's initial. Anyway, if I run it again, it'll change. There's a startup process because it initializes a container and it takes a little longer, and then subsequent runs go a little faster. So let me hit it again. And so this time, let's see what it says. This one says it's time, it says 1.7 milliseconds. Hopefully that's less than what it did before when it was starting up a container. All right, so this time it says 1.7 milliseconds if we're looking at the right places. So with a hot server up and running, if you will, without any startup time being added to it, now it's only taking that long. All right, so that's running a test. Let's see what I'm asking us to do next. Let me see if I can move my navigation to another window because that's driving me crazy. Nope, it will not. Oh, that's annoying. Okay. So notice the JSON response at the top that tell you the data went to CloudWatch. If you're doing this for an assignment in my classes, record your progress here by answering that question. All right, now let's work on our Lambda function. So we want to update index.js. So we go to the code tab and we're going to replace the code that's there with this. So I'm going to try and copy paste, and I'm failing miserably. Oh, this is annoying. Okay. After about 4 tries, I still don't think I got the letter C there. Okay, so we go back to the code tab, and I'm just gonna paste over all that. And I lost my letter L, and I lost my formatting, which is kind of annoying, but I think it will still work just fine. Just let me make it at least a little bit more readable. Add some tabs or something. All right. Well, and this technically could all, anyway, that's annoying to look at. Oh, wait, let me do. Anyway, it needs some more indenting, but that helps. Basically, I'm generating some a response variable, and I'm going to return it. Okay, but the important part here is not the formatting. It's that I created a array at the top, a list of items, and regardless of what is passed into this function, I'm taking this statically created data and I'm sending that as the body attribute of my function. Let's see if this other stuff is still open. So before it returned this information with a success code and this information, I would like it to have a list of donuts instead as something that gets returned. So I will find save somewhere on here. Where I can't even find it. Well, I think it's auto saving, so I don't have to worry about that. Yeah, so we're good. Okay, so let's see. I'm probably supposed to test it next. So let's just, oh, all right. Deployment. We have a deploy button on the left-hand side. So right now you're really just looking at a code editor that's just, I don't know if it's saving your data in an S3 bucket or something like that. But this is just kind of ephemeral, temporary data in a way. It's not actually saved to a Docker container where it runs yet. So if we click this, then this function gets pushed out to some mysterious Docker container somewhere that, so we'll click deploy, and now it says successfully updated our function or our Docker container somewhere. And now we can click the test button again, and we will be able to see some results that will look, well, so we'll go click test, we'll look on empty test event, and then we'll see the results. Okay, so over here, so the way that I ran test before was using this tab, but I can also do it by clicking here. So I could click test, and what it did is over here, it created some output. And notice it says status code 200, and here's the information that came back from the function. Well, both that, but especially the body information. We also have some additional stuff. Another way that we could have run this function is we created our empty test event before. So if we come down here, I can click play. So I haven't got into that information yet, but the idea is that over here under tests, I can create a number of different tests over here. And so basically I could practice passing in different types of information and then have my Lambda function coded to accept different types of information and handle different types of information. And I can test that then by, doing one event and then another event and seeing what happens. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. All right, let's go on down. How long did it take for your function to run? So it'll tell you that there. Okay, so right now it's not very exciting to just run it in a browser. Let's go ahead and make it so it runs more publicly for the entire world rather than just in the console browser for AWS. If we go to configuration, there's something called function URL, and you can create a function URL. And we're going to have no authorization under additional settings. We're going to say allow access from anywhere. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. So right now, on this page, this overview of our function, there's no URL. There's nothing that the public could do to see the data that's generated by our function. The old-fashioned way of doing this, if you will, or the earliest way was you had to create your function here, and then you had to go over to another service called API Gateway and then connect these things. And more recently, they've said, I think they've probably listened to customers and realized that's a lot of work. And so is there a way that we can very quickly make this data that I'm generating in here show up in a URL? So that's what this feature is, and let's show you how it works. We go over to configuration, and over on the left-hand side, we look for function URL. So we want to put a URL to our function, create the function URL, no authentication, additional settings, configure course response. We're allowing access from anywhere, and we will click save. So now there is a URL listed here, and if we click on it, there we go. There is a unique URL in this world, and it generates some JSON content, the exact same content we saw as when we were testing, and we're seeing this. So in particular, this is being sent to web browsers when you use the function URL. So the body is the parameter that you want to set things at to be seen by people reading your API, in essence. Awesome sauce. Okay, so got that to work. Oops, so there's some class-related things. All right, so we got that to work. There's your URL. If you're doing this for an assignment, write down that. Okay, now we want to display this data in a web page. Create an HTML page on your local computer. All right, so this will take a second here. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code on my computer, and I need to find a place to put an HTML page. So I'm going to create a to delete folder on my computer, and I will show that in just a second. Sample page. Okay, so I just created a folder in the hierarchy of my computer, and I just called it sample page. And then I'm going to take, you can just use any text editor you want, text edit, something like that is fine. So I'll say, with Visual Studio Code opened, I will now look for, oops, anyway, this folder and open it. And now I'm ready to create a page. So I will close that, and I will say index.html and come back over here. Create a next, oh, well, it says call it donut display page.html. Doesn't really matter what you call it, it's fine. It says basically copy and paste in the HTML and replace the URL with the function URL that you did in the previous section. Okay, so this is actually HTML right here, even though it's kind of hard to see. Should be anyway. I don't know if I got a correct copy paste there. We'll find out in a second. I did. And I lost all my formatting again. Oh well. Coming over here, let's find, here's the URL, the API that was just created. And I'm going to replace this old one from previous testing with this new one. I will hit save. And so in my folder here, I can double click on this page and notice what it does. It creates an alert pop-up, and it contains the data that was there. So if we're looking at our, yeah, so what happened here? So we have an empty, well, maybe I'll look at it in Visual Studio Code. We have an HTML page, and in the body of the page where you usually put your text, I just put in a JavaScript tag, and I have some JavaScript code that calls the built-in function fetch. So this isn't really important. This is just helping you understand conceptually, if you have an HTML page, how does JavaScript work to go read a URL, an API, and this is how it works. So you take any technology you want that could read from APIs, in this case, the fetch function that's built into JavaScript that runs in web browsers, and you say, hey, go grab this data, and then when you get it back, interpret it as JSON, and then take that data and then do, and the last little function here says, do an alert box that displays the data that you pulled down from that URL. So that's what all that does. Okay, let's carry on. So step one, we've got an HTML page working. Nice. All right, let's go ahead. That was a proof of concept. Let's go ahead and modify the HTML page a little bit. And so I'm going to, once again, copy everything. Oops. And I need that URL again. Okay, so what are we doing here? We have an HTML page with a title on it. This time in the body of our page, we have a div tag, and the div tag is empty, so it's just a container to hold some content. So conceptually, this is the same thing as if you were on a page like this and there was a div tag and maybe it's empty, your JavaScript call can then populate that thing on the page. So coming back to here, we're saying once we get all our data pulled down by the fetch function, it's saying, hey, your data is in an array, so let's create a for loop out of that. And for each thing that's in it, we are going to access this box and we're going to add a piece of text and put a line break after it. And again, this is just very rudimentary, but it should give you the idea of how this works. Okay, so let me go ahead and open this one more time. And now we have our div box, and instead of ugly stuff like just plain JSON, now we actually are reading each individual element in the array, and we're taking the text and formatting it, if you will. So it would be relatively trivial to stylize this as we're doing a loop and printing it out to create something that looks more like that. Maybe in our data that we're pulling down, we also include, if this was in this, the Amazon page, you can include a URL in addition to some text where you're pulling down an image from. But that would be the process. You just have an API you hit, and then you parse through an array of data that you got back down. Sweet. So you just did something super awesome. If you do that 2 or 3 times, you realize, wow, it can take just a minute, and you've created an API that you can use in pages that has data in it. And it's basically infinitely scalable, which is super awesome. All right, now let's do, so like I said before, that's great for when you're first getting started with development, but as you get into a more robust development process, you're going to find that you want multiple versions of the URLs that you're using for testing, for production, et cetera, et cetera. So, and also you're going to need security built in and things like that, because maybe you don't want everybody having access to this depending on the nature of your software. So there's a whole bunch of configuration you can do on the basic function URL that you might need later. And so let's go ahead and learn about API Gateway. So looking at our instructions, it says go to API Gateway, create a REST. We want HTTP API, I think. HTTP, the HTTP version is newer, so we want that one. So let's build an HTTP one, and there's got to be a name for it too that we want. Let's see if I specified. Create an API. Sorry, it's taking me a second. There's no donut list API. I'll have it in just a second here. Oh boy. Okay, so we don't get to name it yet. Let's just get started. Okay, so I type in API Gateway. So if you remember from the diagram, technically these URLs are API Gateway, and then they pass the request over to the Lambda function that's running in a Docker container. So we're now configuring this service. So I'm going to click Create API. We want to use the newer version of APIs. And let's see, the first thing we will do is add an integration. So the idea is if a request comes to here, where is it supposed to send the data to? Or what is it supposed to talk to when a specific URL is hit? That's the integration. So we're going to add an integration, and we're going to do that. And let's see. We need an endpoint. So let's see how we're doing this. Any daily donut list. Hold on a second. Create an integration, Lambda. See, it should be, something didn't work right there. Let me see. I know how to do this if I'm not talking, but let's see. Add Lambda function as your integration. The integration. See, it's supposed to have some pop-up stuff. So what's it doing? Oh, Lambda. Sorry, I didn't see that there. Okay, we have a Lambda function. I knew something was wrong because I was looking for a drop-down menu. All right, so we're looking for our Lambda function that says daily donut list. There we go. Much better. All right, and let's see if we're doing this in order. So we selected that. We'll call it donut list API, and it will look like that, and then we'll click next. Okay, sorry about the clunkiness on that particular step. Donut list API. So this makes perfect sense. We named it. We are connecting it to something. We will click next. And one of the reasons why I have function URLs is because it's you need to know less as well to set that up. When you get a little deeper, there's more to know and more to configure. And so if you know how HTTP works, there's a bunch of different ways that URLs are invoked. They're used for posting, like in a form. They're used for GET, etc. And so you may or may not be aware of all those ways of using URLs from HTML pages, but we need to set up some routes, if you will. And so I think I'm going to leave it at any. Let's see. We've got an any. Nope, we're going to change it to get. Okay. All right. So think about this. When you're hitting a URL, you could be sending a command to retrieve information, to add information. So let's talk about add for a second. So we've already seen retrieving, and that's the get method. But what if you wanted to use that API to add, for example, an additional product to a list, or add an additional item to a cart? Well, you could use the exact same URL or API technically, but if it's perceived as being accessed by the put method, then the API will go, oh, maybe I'm going to use this other Lambda function on the back end. So it's the same URL, but maybe there's one Lambda function for reading, one Lambda function for adding things to a list that's in a database, and another Lambda function for deleting something. So one URL, depending on the HTTP method that is sent, could result in multiple or different distinct Lambda functions being triggered. So one API URL, multiple Lambda functions. That's why we have the API gateway service, is so that we can differentiate what we're supposed to do when we receive an incoming request on the URL. And as part of this thing, I'm not going to differentiate. So I could say that backend target is a different thing, but I'm just going to make them all the same. But I've explained to you how it actually works. So we got get, post, and delete. So let's go ahead and add those. So here's get, here's post, and let's see, for fun, oh yeah, add donut. All right. And we'll have it go to the same place and delete. Let me also explain something else. Notice it says resource path. what this means is that when we're finished creating this API, we're no longer going to be able to call just a plain URL. We're going to need to add on to our URL, it's not created yet, this additional path or resource information so we know which, I guess, route or ultimately which backend function we want to call. So this is unlike function URLs. We need to add in this additional path information when we call the URL. So that's that. I think we're going to leave it with this. Don't want to explain that. We don't need additional stages at this point. We're going to go to our confirmation page and see it all be done. Next. Overview. Next. Okay, so this is how it looks. We're looking at it. We have some donut list API in API gateway, and it has these URLs that can be added to the actual API URL, which we don't see yet. This is a little bit about how a given URL is mapped to a different, if I click on that, a different set of services. Okay, let's try and go with what it says in there. It says test it. So we're going to go on the left navigation, find stages, find default, and there's a URL. Okay, so we come over here, we go to stages, default, there's our URL, there's our API. So I'm going to copy it, paste it in, and it's going to say nothing. And why is it giving us nothing? Because like I explained before, you have to pass in for this which of the resources that you're trying to get at, or which Lambda function you're trying to get at. And so we have some additional information for that. We can add in daily donut list if I remembered to type that in. Let's see if I can't remember if I did that correctly or not when I was setting up the routes, but if I go daily, donut list. Yes, okay, that is how I created it. And that returns the get information. So let's go back and figure out where that was anyway. So I'm going to click on this right here, I believe is where I can look. No, that's not where I can look. Routes. I go to routes and I go to, so one of the routes is daily donut list. So I was allowed to type that in, and so that's what I did. What are my other routes? I can also do add donut. Now it's going to, what do I do? Not type it in, right? Oh, I think they're at the method is an issue, but it's expecting a post, which is like a form post, and I can't do that from here. So we won't worry about that right now. But if it was a form post, then it would send back it would go to that same URL. The API gateway, when it got this route just now, it said, this is a GET request on this URL. And so it didn't have anything to respond to. So I confused it. But if I did a form post, if you know how to write those, you can also use the program curl, I think, and then some other command line based terminal window based things, or Postman, if you're familiar with that program. There's a number of programs you can use to do a form, to emulate a form post in addition to writing an HTML form, which would allow you to trigger this post action from the perspective of the API on the back end. Let's see. All right, so we got to do that. So there's our daily donut list. Yippee skippy. There's our routes. We've got our get route, which talks more about that. It refers to our Lambda function. I've already explained it. Manage integrations. Okay, so how did we get to that one? Let's just see if we can get there real quick. So here's get, here's configure. So there it is. We've got, anyway, it's got some naming that it's done. And anyway, it's just letting us know that we're talking to this particular Lambda function and blah, 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 blah. We don't really need to care about that too much. Let's find, okay, so we already did this where we clicked on the URL from stages and we entered it in. That's what we did. We found message not found, but if we add daily donut list, then everything's good, as we would expect. Okay, so now let's go to our previous HTML page and use our new URL. So if this is our working URL with daily donut list in here, then let's go back to our HTML page that we had before. So this is our function URL. I'm going to replace it with this and hit save. And then I will find this page, open it up, and nothing happened. This is actually the div box that was there. What has happened? Okay, so something broke. Now with the function URL, if you recall, one of the last items we said under like advanced details was a CORS request that said, allow this API to be called from anywhere. We didn't do anything like this with API Gateway. So that is actually what broke. And if we look under like the JavaScript notes, developer tools for this page, it'll probably tell us that something broke there. So let's go read about that. Oh no, it says, so view developer JavaScript console. So view developer JavaScript console. And there it is. It's gonna see access to the fetch method for this URL got null back, blocked by CORS policy. So we're allowed to lock down things for our APIs. So we need to fix that if we want it to run. So how do we do that? In API Gateway, there is a CORS option, and we're going to go over to the left side, and we're going to update the CORS policies. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things set there. And we're going to do the star, which means anything, on 1. And well, that could work. All right, let's see what we can do. Well, let me just try something really quick. I've installed a plugin called Live Server. So let's just go over here and extensions, Live Server. So if you do that and you install, that means that anytime that you're looking at a plain HTML page, you can click on Go Live. So let me try this. Let's see if it does anything interesting. Nope, it does the exact same thing. So what's different about this is reading off of my local hard drive. This is emulating a local server. Why does that matter? I don't know, we'll come back to that in a second. So I come over here to API Gateway. I go to CORS, and I want it so that it can be served up from anywhere. So I'm going to click on configure. I'm going to say come from anywhere, and then I have to click save, and then see my finger, then I think we also have to click deploy. Oh shoot. Oh, it says successfully created. Let me just double check on this. It might have automatically done it, but I think we have to redeploy our thing. Click the add button, click save. Okay. Sometimes, I'm not crazy. Sometimes you do have to say deploy on your URLs. Like you're making changes in API Gateway, and if you don't deploy it, then it doesn't get picked up. It's just saved in your web browser configurations or something. So anyway, with that, if I do this and I reload, so this is just served off of my local computer, it still gives me a CORS policy error. But if I use this other one that acts more like a real web browser would, it works. So basically, if this page were being served off of any real web server with a URL, on the planet and you put this little you put this block of code in there, it would now work. So it's beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about course policies and stuff like that. But there's the basic steps for using API gateway to serve up content that is created by a Lambda function. Okay, there it is. So you've done something super awesome. Yay. Now, one thing, if I'm just going to editorialize for a minute, it is technically confusing to set up API gateway, set up a URL, set up an integration, set up all the different routes that relate to different HTTP methods, and then potentially have you can even set up versioning here. And then there's your course policies. So the reason why I think function URL exists is because when you're first getting started, this second half of this tutorial is like mind-blowing, right? If you do this stuff all day long every day, then eventually you know all these details and stuff like that, and it's not so bad. But if you just want your Lambda function to print hello world to a page to see it work, you don't really want to go through all of these steps and be going through all kinds of different links over here and then have to have different URLs with, routes on the end of them to get testing done. Like it's too much for your brain. But as you get more robust in your development, then you have to do all of these things. But okay, sweet. Let's see if I've got anything else that I wanted to cover. Oh, okay. Explore Lambda starter templates. So we've covered all of the really hands-on stuff for the most part, but let's look at this. If you were to imagine making big giant applications right now, so let's just say that you understand that there's a bunch of AWS services out there, like maybe I want to have a Lambda. Well, there are a lot of Lambda services, or actually AWS services. So if you want to talk to DynamoDB, if you want to talk to RDS in your favorite language, if you want to be receiving communication from an API gateway, you start to realize, wow, I got a lot of stuff to learn to figure all that out. And there's a lot of AWS services as well, in addition to like DynamoDB and RDS as a backend target that your Lambda function can be talking to. It can also be reading from SQS queues. Like there's all kinds of ways to interact with Lambda. And if you're going to be Googling and using like AI, ChatGPT, et cetera, you're going to have a lot of work ahead of you to figure out how to string together all the components to get everything to work. Fortunately, a lot of these use cases are super common, and we have starter templates that will allow you to like basically write all the boilerplate code for you, and then you just move forward, which is like, oh, thank you. Okay, so let's kind of look around at that. We'll create a new function, click on use blueprint, and see what's available. So we go over here, and let's go back to Lambda. Create a function, use a blueprint, and let's say we've got a whole bunch of sample blueprints. Well, they will write the code for you. Looks like not all of them are in the most recent versions of the language runtimes. So if you're going to use, let's see if we got one with like a database. So this one interacts with a database. So if you want to interact with the database, you can't use node 22, you got to use node 18 because they haven't written the code for 22 yet. But you could select different things, and here's the code for it. So you could even learn to code by looking at, learn to code to their services, or you can just look up the documentation for the SDK. So just let me give you a little hint here. Like, where does this magic come from for talking to a DynamoDB table? There is a JavaScript SDK for DynamoDB, for example. So you'll find that on AWS's official documentation. If we pull up the Python example, there's going to be a Python SDK for DynamoDB, and you would need that if you're customizing this code that's written here. All right, so awesome sauce. There's tons of different services you can interact with, and the boilerplate code is started for you if you were to use that. Ooh, look at that one. A microservice that interacts with the DynamoDB table. So I was just talking about, well, earlier I've been talking about how you can use these URLs, configure them so that they can be used for reading, deleting, updating data in a database. This particular one that I'm referring to is if you look up the microservice option under Blueprints, it's going to have the code in there for adding information to DynamoDB under certain URLs, deleting under others, and reading under others. So it's kind of a pretty robust version of creating an API for serving up something on a page, which is pretty cool. So you get a lot of the work done for you. Ooh, it looks like I'm going to have you actually do this. So, oh, I just have you going through the steps there if you want. So I get you most of the way. So if you want to, you could follow this. I say select the microservice, look at the code. You have to create a new role and you go, there's a couple more clicks in the instructions, and then you'd be basically done. Here's samples of the code. I'm just going to have you do it if you want. But then I tell you, you can hit cancel if you don't know. So I get you all the way to the end of the road, and then I say you can either click create or hit cancel for that particular blueprint for a microservice. So I'm not going to have us do that here. All right. I ask you if you're doing a tutorial to, or if you're doing this for an assignment, that you look at other blueprints that might be interesting. Oh, yeah. Okay. So so Blueprints is one option for working with Lambda functions, but another fantastic resource is the serverless application repository. So there's common services that you're going to be interacting with, DynamoDB, API Gateway, SQS, etc. And they have code that is written for you to create those. So let's go ahead and look at that. Serverless application repository. So we've got over 1,100 applications, and I don't even know what I want to look up here. Dynam. So think of just something you want to do. DynamoDB. So 35 things related to DynamoDB. So you could have Lambda functions that are talking to S3. I'm not seeing some great ones. Did I have any suggestions there? No. But I did say you might try typing in like Alexa, or sorry, I've lost my URL here. So let's just say that you wanted to use your functions to talk to Alexa. Anyway, just about anything you can conceive of doing, they have basically these should create well, there's something called well, there's Terraform if you're familiar with that, and then the AWS version, which is CloudFormation. What these should do is create a whole infrastructure for you that does basic things with all the moving parts. So that's what all this is about. So it's super awesome. It sounds like the same thing I said before with Blueprints, but this is even more robust. It's entire applications that are just you just run it and then the whole thing is running and then you can just customize it, which is awesome. So think about it as like a streamlined version of like a page like this, where everything's going to be done. The database is going to be created. Everything is done for you for a particular thing, like a static HTML page with the service, and then you just start updating things. So that's kind of super nice. Awesome. All right. So we did the fun stuff. Okay, now I say explore a featured serverless app. Okay, let's see if I can find that. In the AWS Lambda function, click on applications in the left bar. Okay, so here's like a third option for getting to things you might use all the time. All right, so here we are, Lambda, applications, create an application. And so an application is thought of as of a whole bunch of things that need to work together. So it sounds like the last two things I talked about, blueprints as well as serverless application repository. Here's a kind of like another version of that. Let's see what we've got through. Wow. If you think about development in the bigger perspective, you go, oh, I don't want to just like make a one-off function. Ooh, I also want that as part of maybe I need a whole CI/CD pipeline. So I need not only do I want my function, but I want a code repository and I want a code pipeline that pushes it into production. And maybe I want dev and staging and testing because when we get more robust, we actually do all those things. We don't just do an application. We don't just like write a function in the console. We actually, as we develop over time, we need much more plumbing for robust development. And so they're giving you the ability to create that plumbing really easily related to what you're going to do. So like right now we had like what we were just demoing earlier was like a serverless, a Lambda API backend. We created an API. So they're saying, hey, let's do this. But this one's going to come complete with API gateway and DynamoDB. And it's going to include a code pipeline. So mind-blowing, awesome stuff. Let's see which one I'm recommending that we're going to do together. Create an application, read the descriptions, how many are there, click on the one serverless API backend, which is one that I like. That one's in node 18. And it shows you a depiction of what will be created when you do all of this. And let's see. Oh, sadly, I'm not having us do that. So you could do that. There's a bunch of other good stuff. And we're actually going to stop there. So I just wanted to make you aware that, so if I go back to the beginning of this, we did some basic hello world things. We talked about test events and things like that. But as you get more, further down the line, you want to make really complicated applications with code pipelines, talking to databases, etc. And you have a variety of ways to get you started with that. So now let's go ahead and just clean up all of our stuff. So let's go, let's show you this. Let's go over into CloudWatch. So first, so this is where all the logging was being created for every time we ran a Lambda function. So I go to log groups, and I think I need to type in donut. So here's our daily donut list. If you want to go through the click path for there, you'll see the messages that looked identical to the little white boxes when we were running tests earlier. So you can click through there if you want. Otherwise, I'm going to say just get rid of all of this stuff because I don't need it. Next item in my cleanup list is go to the Lambda console and clean up daily donut list. So we'll come to Lambda and find my daily donut list. And I will say delete you. And so the initial URL that we'd created that didn't have any path on it would now disappear along with the function URL associated with it. And then later we created our API gateway URL that also hit the same function. So we actually had multiple API URLs, and this one still exists, but it doesn't have any backend to go to. I wonder what will happen if we hit this. Internal server error. So API gateway is still configured, but there's no Lambda function anymore. So the next thing we need to do is go get rid of that API gateway service, API gateway. And we find the donut list API and we click delete. And we are done. All right, I hope that was helpful for you, and I look forward to going into deeper detail on some related things in future videos. Have a good day.